The focal length you use to take a photo will significantly affect the photo you create. It will determine what is in a photo, what is not in a photo, how small or large the elements of a photo are, and how the elements in your photo relate to each other. The focal length you use will also determine the depth of field in a photo, or as I like to call it, depth of sharpness, because that's what it is. Basically, the focal length you use will significantly impact the photo you get. Let's find out all about this in this splendid episode, and that was the answery bit. Hi, and a very warm welcome to episode 203, no less. Blimey, how did that happen? Well, now it happened. I've done 203 episodes, but it seems a lot. Sorry, episode 203 of the Photography Explained podcast. I'm your host Rick, and in each episode I will try to explain one photographic thing to you in plain English in less than 27 minutes-ish without the irrelevant details. Yes, really. I'm a professionally qualified photographer based in England with a lifetime of photographic experience which I share with you in my splendid podcast. And no rules this week, which has to be a good thing, doesn't it? Yes, it does. Right, so what is focal length in photography? Let's start at the beginning with what the actual focal length is and what it means. So the focal length of a lens is the physical dimension between the lens and the camera sensor. Now, which bit of the lens are we measuring from here? Well, it's the bit within the lens where the light rays are travelling without changing direction. Okay, I'm going to stop there because to say any more would take me into the realms of irrelevant details. Knowing any more would not help me, and I'm not clever enough to explain that bit in the lens, so let's move on, dear listener. But there is a significant thing here though. In general terms, the larger the focal length, the larger the lens. Now, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Regardless of whereabouts in the lens we're measuring from. I need to go through some stuff quickly here. I want to talk more about composition than the technical stuff in this episode, so I'm going to go through the technical stuff very quickly as a recap. But check out episode 189, Camera Lenses Explained, my beginner's guide, for lots more on lenses, not surprisingly. And a very good episode it was too. Right, focal lengths explained quickly. To explain focal lengths so we normal people can understand, let's start with a standard lens. A standard lens has a focal length of 50mm on a full frame camera. Yeah, sorry, but we get into complications straight away. A full frame camera has a sensor that is 36mm wide by 24mm high. There are crop sensor cameras and micro four thirds cameras, which both have different crop factors, which makes this even more complicated. I'll come back to crop factors in a bit, but let me first go through this for full frame cameras, because everything applies. You just need to do a bit of mental gymnastics to make sense of it. Okay, a 50mm focal length on a full frame camera. It gives a horizontal field of view, or angle of view as I prefer to say, of about 40 degrees. And this is similar to how humans see the world. It's similar in angle of view, field of view, and also in perspective, I guess. Yeah, I prefer angle of view to field of view. Do we have to be in a field? Sorry, quite sad I know, and not important here, so I'm going to move on. And a wide-angle lens has a focal length smaller than 50. The smaller the number, the wider the focal length, the wider the field of view, the larger the depth of field, and the further away and smaller things in a photo look. A telephoto lens has a focal length larger than 50. The larger the number, the larger the focal length, the narrower the field of view, the shallower the depth of field, and the larger things look in a photo. Nice and simple so far, isn't it? Okay, crop factors explained quickly. A micro four thirds camera has a crop factor of 2 times. A crop sensor camera has a crop factor of 1.5 to 1.6 times, depending on the actual sensor size. Yes, unfortunately, with crop sensor cameras, these vary with different manufacturers and indeed with different models, but micro four thirds, it's 2. Good old micro four thirds. And the reason for this is that crop sensor cameras have sensors smaller than those in full-frame cameras, and Micro Four Thirds cameras have sensors smaller than those in crop sensor cameras. I'm sure it's a lot more complicated than that, but that's the bottom line that affects us photographers. But what does this mean, Rick? Simple. Well, it's not really, but a 50mm focal length on a crop sensor camera gives an effective focal length of 50 times 1.5 or 1.6-ish, which is 75 to 80mm. A 50mm focal length on a Micro Four Thirds camera gives an effective focal length of 50 times 2, which is 100mm. I know it's more complicated than we'd like, but it's not that bad, is it? Now, the mystery for me is, why doesn't 50mm on a Micro Four Thirds lens say 100mm, which is the actual focal length? I know it's not the focal length as such, because it's the distance from the sensor to part of the lens, but do we give a stuff about that, if we're being honest? No, we don't. So, yep, more complicated than we'd like, not that bad, but it could have been done a bit simpler, couldn't it? And that's the nuts and bolts of how focal length affects the composition. That's the technical side of it. And as I said earlier, I'm not going into the technical side too much here. I just needed to explain some fundamentals. And now I'm going to move on to the compositional side of things. Composition and focal length. Composition is what you include in a photo and how the things in your composition relate to each other. Your focal length will determine what you include and indeed do not include in a photo. With a 20mm focal length, the horizontal angle of view is about 84 degrees. With a 50mm standard lens, it's about 40 degrees. And with a 200mm focal length, it's about 10 degrees. I think we can quickly relate what we see about 40 degrees, which is a 50mm standard lens, more or less, to an angle of view of 84 degrees, which is a massive difference. That's a 20mm focal length, which gives us an angle of view that is more than double what we see. And that 200mm focal length, it gives us the middle quarter of what we're looking at. So, significant differences. A 50mm focal length pretty much replicates what we see and how we see things relative to each other. The wider the focal length, the further apart things appear in a photo. And the longer the focal length, the closer things appear to each other in a photo. And again, focal length is relative to what we see at 50mm, which on a crop sensor camera is 75 to 80mm, and on a Micro Four Thirds camera is 100mm. So, whichever of the three you're using, larger than the standard equivalent telephoto, less than wide angle. It is that simple. One problem with wide angle lenses is that the subject matter can get lost in a photo if you're not close enough to it. But if you're shooting a wide vista, that's fine. That's what you want, isn't it? But with a telephoto lens, you can fill the frame with the subject matter and exclude everything else, which can be a good or bad thing depending on what you're trying to achieve. So if you want photos that look natural and familiar, a 50mm focal length seems to be a good idea, right? Well, there are many views on this, but ultimately this is up to you, dear listener, and what you want to get from your photography. And that's the point. There are so many variables, but the best focal length, it depends on what you photograph and how you want to convey what you're photographing. Yes, this is down to you, dear listener, and this is the beauty of photography. As the photographer, you take all these variables and use them to take the best photos you can. Okay, the other factor, where you are. Where you place yourself will have a huge impact on a photo. Rather than zooming in using a lens, you can always get closer to the subject matter, or you can go further away. Where you are, relative to what you're photographing, affects the composition and how the focal length works with the composition. Depth of field, or depth of sharpness as I like to call it. No, I know, I can't help myself. Aperture and focal length both influence the depth of sharpness in a photo. Small aperture, large number, more depth of field. Large aperture, small number, less depth of field. I know, it could have been the other way around, couldn't it? As in large aperture, large number. But no, we have reciprocals here just to make it more complicated. Thanks, photography world. Long focal length, less depth of field? Wide focal length, more depth of field. They're quite straightforward, aren't they? And then there's dear old perspective. With a long focal length, things appear closer together. And with a wide focal length, things appear further apart. Yep, the focal length will determine the perspective and how close things are to each other. But if you take a photo of something very close up using a wide-angle focal length, this will change how everything looks. And with a long telephoto lens, things can look compressed and closer together. And this is the beauty of focal length. You can use focal length creatively to transform a photo. Now, if you think about it, 50mm is roughly how we see things. So if you go super wide, it's different from what we're used to seeing, and the same with telephoto. So there's a very creative side to focal lengths, and that's why it's so important and so useful to us. Okay, a quick word on sharpness. The longer the focal length, the more magnified the image is, and the less forgiving the camera is to blur in photos caused by camera shake. Now, I know the camera's not shaking, but that's the term we've ended up with for any movement when taking a photo that causes a blurry photo. Camera shake? Don't start me on that one. That's why if you're shooting handheld, your shutter speed should be faster than the reciprocal of the focal length. Now, in English, this means if you're taking a photo handheld with a 200mm focal length, your shutter speed should be faster than 1/200th of a second, unless you've got image stabilization, of course, in which case that changes things significantly. Right, well, that's it. That's all I want to say here. And this little lot might explain why there are so many lenses and so many different focal lengths for us to choose from, in case you were wondering. Well, I've got a few things more to say, but that was the main answery bit. What focal length should I use? Now, I've had a thought here. I'm going to apply this little lot to my photography, which is photos of buildings, landscape photography and travel photography, and I think that an episode on each of these will finish this series of episodes on composition rather nicely. How utterly splendid. Right, here are some things for you to do. Work out what 20mm, 50mm and 200mm look like with your eyes. Just remember 85 odd degrees, 40 odd degrees and 10 degrees, however you do this. Next, take the same photo using the widest focal length you've got, the standard focal length, and the longest focal length that you've got. Take the same photo 3 times and compare the differences. And if you're feeling adventurous, take 3 photos with the maximum aperture, the minimum aperture, and the aperture value in the middle. And have a good look at what you've got. Learning from your own photos taken by you with your own gear is such an effective way to learn. You can see these things on all sorts of articles people have written, but you can't beat doing this yourself. It's a brilliant way to learn about focal length and indeed depth of field / sharpness. And once you've done these things, let me know how you get on. I'd love to hear from you. Okay, what if I use a phone to take photos? Well, focal length's a bit of an issue, isn't it? You just need to forget that it's not physical, as in 100mm. Your phone's not going to be 100mm thick, is it? So how do you get 100mm focal length? But the effect is the same. It's all done by computers and clever stuff, isn't it? Yes, it is, Rick. Let me give you some examples. On my iPhone 15 Pro, the 1x setting is the default, and when I press the 1x bit on the camera app, the focal length of 24mm appears. The 2x lens is 48mm, and the 3x lens is 77mm. Now I know 24 times 3 doesn't equal 77, but who cares? And just to cross-reference this, using one of my apps, the 1x lens gives a field of view of 71 degrees, while 24mm on a full-frame camera gives a field of view of 73 degrees. Yes, I've done some work here, haven't I? So, similar, not identical, but generally the same. And I quite like the iPhone with the 1x, 2x, etc. It gets rid of the numbers that we don't really care about, and it leaves us with what we can see, which I like. So using a phone, you have the focal length just like you do with the camera, if the numbers are a bit different, but you get the same effect. In fact, the 1 times and 2 times everything, that was part of my plan to decimalize photography, because 50mm, do we care what 50mm actually is? No, we don't. Adding a crop factor makes more of a mockery of it anyway, so might as well do 1 times and 2 times, and then we can all be universal and get on splendidly. Right, what do? I have a Canon 17 to 40mm lens. The 17mm end of the focal length gives me a whopping 93-degree field of view. I also have an Olympus 12 to 40mm lens, but the 12mm gives me a paltry 71 degrees because of the crop factor. I need an 8.5mm focal length lens on my Micro Four Thirds camera to get the same field of view as I can with my Canon 17mm lens. Yes, 2 times 8.5 equals 17. See, crop factor's not that bad, is it? And I use 17mm for most of the photos that I take, and that is what I do. Some thoughts from the last episode. Did you check out the rule of thirds? How did you get on with it? Let me know, it'd be lovely to hear from you. Okay, next episode. Wait for it. 10 landscape photography composition tips that will instantly improve your shots. Yes, really, it's time to put all this composition stuff to practical use, and I'm excited to do this. Time for a quick plug for me and what I do. Well, why not? If I can't plug myself on my own podcast, where can I? You found this podcast, so why not check out the podcast website, photographyexplainedpodcast.com. And I have another photography website, rickmcavoyphotography.com, where I write blog posts about my photographs of buildings and other good stuff. And on my courses page, rickmcavoyphotography.com/courses, you will find my splendid course, How to Become a Real Estate Photographer. And you can also find me on YouTube talking about my podcast and my blog, all good stuff. Just type my name in and you'll find me soon enough. Get an email from me. Yes, if you want a weekly email from me, and why wouldn't you? Fill in the box on any of my websites, and every Friday you will read what I'm thinking about photography related. And that's enough of the self-promotion. If you've got a question you would like me to answer, or you just want to say hi, email me sales@rickmcavoyphotography.co.uk. Visit the podcast website or text me from the podcast feed. So many ways to get in touch, and always lovely to hear from you, dear listeners. Right, this episode was brought to you by, wait for it, a cheese and pickle sandwich and a bag of salt and vinegar crisps. Yes, I'm back to my bad old ways here, which I consumed before settling in my homemade acoustically cushioned recording emporium. I've been Rick McAvoy. Thanks again for listening to my small but perfectly formed podcast, it says here, and for giving me 27 minutes-ish of your valuable time. Now, I reckon this episode's going to be about, 18, 19 minutes long after I've edited out the mistakes and the other bad stuff, which is what I'm aiming for, which is splendid. Thanks for listening. Take care. Stay safe. Cheers from me, Rick.